Hello and welcome to this segment of Arts Talk. I'm Sherri Burr, your host, and my co-host for this segment is going to be Sheila Jones, who's a third year law student now. Yeah, she's almost out of here. And we are so happy to have as our special guest Hampton Sides, who's the author of this new book, New York Times bestselling book called Hellhound on His Trail. And it's about the stalking of Martin Luther King Jr. and the international search hunt for his assassin. So welcome, Hampton. It's so great to have you.
Good to be here with you guys.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the premise of your book?
Well, the book is really about the largest manhunt in American history, the FBI's search for James Earl Ray. I grew up in Memphis. The assassination of Martin Luther King was the biggest thing that ever happened, really, in my hometown. And I think this book started because I was interested in, as many writers are wont to do, I wanted to go back to my hometown and sort of figure out Memphis, figure out why these events happened in Memphis, what brought King to Memphis, and then who was this guy James Earl Ray, and why did it take the FBI so long to find him? So yeah, you know, it started out really as a kind of a Memphis kid who wants to go back and try to understand his hometown. But then it became this much bigger story because James Earl Ray went everywhere. I mean, this guy got around. He was in, after he broke out of prison, he was in Montreal, Toronto, Birmingham, Puerto Vallarta, and then he went on after the assassination to Toronto, Montreal, Portugal, finally London, where he was captured, about to board a plane on his way to Rhodesia, where he wanted to become a mercenary soldier. So it really just follows his fugitive wanderings, and it really looks very closely at how the FBI, this organization that had done almost everything it could do to ruin King's career and try to smear his name, then became responsible for finding his killer, and how the sort of everything switched when they were given this task of tracking this guy down.
Now, you describe him in the book as kind of a shapeshifter because he has many different names, many different aliases, the way he looks. So what was that like in terms of your doing the research for that?
Well, I think that in some ways he had what you might call a multiple personality disorder. I mean, he had 39 different aliases during his criminal career. When he was growing up, his family changed its last name repeatedly. I really think he had some major kind of identity questions stewing within himself. During the course of the narrative, which is about 3 years, he has 6, 7, 8, 9 different aliases. He is Eric Galt. He is Harvey Lohmeyer. He's John Willard. He's Ramon Snade. He's Paul Bridgman. And he's really good at finding these identities and sort of inhabiting them, trying to change the way he looks and the way he acts. And he is kind of a shapeshifter in that way. You just, as soon as you think you've got him figured out, he's moved on over here. He's changed his name, he's changed his location, he's changed his story. And this was one of the reasons why it took the FBI and other international police organizations so long to find this guy.
Okay, Sheila?
When you were writing the book, did you happen to retrace the steps and go back and visit the places that Martin Luther King's assassin had gone from Mexico to Memphis? Yeah,
I mean, that was part of the fun of doing the book. James Earl Ray, as I mentioned earlier, he got around and he went to some nice places too. He didn't usually stay in very nice inns and hotels. He usually stayed in these god-awful flop houses.
Were you trying to stay exactly where he stayed so that if he stayed in a flop house, you were staying
whenever
in a flop?
possible, yes. Now, a lot of these times, these places have changed or they aren't even on the map anymore. I did find the neighborhood in Lisbon where he spent a week, and I found a prostitute who I believe was staying. Yeah, serviced him. Yeah, thank you, thank you. I went to Puerto Vallarta and found the hotel which is actually a fairly decent hotel now. I stayed in the same place where he stayed in London. So yeah, I mean, that was part of it, just to kind of get a feel for his movements, for his style, for his, just to get a sense of how far-flung this fugitive wandering was of his. And of course it raises the question, where to get the money to do all this far-flung travel? And that's one of the great mysteries that I certainly don't solve. I believe there's good evidence that he and his brothers robbed a bank in Illinois shortly after he escaped from prison the first time, which would have netted him $30,000. And he also says that he was involved in various fencing schemes, smuggling schemes. He sold contraband. He may have robbed some liquor stores and grocery stores. When he got to London, he robbed a jewelry store and he robbed a bank. If those who say this was a vast and shadowy and well-funded conspiracy kind of have to reckon with the fact that here's a guy so desperate for money that he's robbing a bank because he's so low on funds.
Right.
So by the end, no matter whatever help he might have had, he clearly was desperate and was trying to get out of the country because he knew that Scotland Yard at this point was on his case.
So it's interesting that you mentioned about the question of where the funds came from. After doing this research, do you then conclude that he really did operate alone?
I think he had help along the way, crude, low-grade help probably. I know that there are tons of conspiracy theories and some that are very elaborate involving, the FBI, the CIA, the Mafia, the, Memphis Police Department, Memphis Fire Department, the Mayor's Office, the White House, Trilateral Commission, you name it, the Vatican. This doesn't have, to me, when you get into the nitty-gritty of the case, the stamp of a super sophisticated conspiracy. He's doing repeatedly these desperate things that, like I mentioned, trying to rob a bank, doing things that would expose the conspiracy. But he is meeting with people. He's definitely in contact with his brothers. Daryl and his other brother Daryl. Actually, their names are John Larry and Jerry Ray. I'm not sure their help actually constitutes like help. I'm not sure that's going to help you want because James Earl Ray was supposed to be the smart one of the family. But nonetheless, he's clearly in contact with various members of his family and some kind of thugs and various low-life criminal associates. It's possible that he knew about one of the various bounties, and I go into this in the book, that were out on the head of Martin Luther King. I mean, this is not very well known, but there were multiple organizations that had put forward bounties of $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 to kill King. And I think that Ray's intention was to get paid for this. He may have gotten some sort of down payment, but there's really no evidence for it. And the idea was once he could get to a safe place like Rhodesia, he would try to collect on that. That's the best I could come up with in terms of his motive, other than the fact that he was a racist. He was an amphetamine junkie with some serious mental illness, and always kind of the ambitious one of the family, the one that was going to try to be a hustler and pull off some big, ambitious scheme. And he had heard while he was in prison about these various bounties, and talked with people in prison about how this was going to be his retirement plan, to kill King, make history, move to another country where he could elude prosecution. And that's, what the scary thing and the amazing thing is just how close he came to pulling this off. If he had gotten on that plane and hadn't been caught by Scotland Yard at Heathrow Airport, he probably would have made it. He probably would have eluded prosecution. There was no extradition treaty with Rhodesia, and who knows what would have happened.
Wow, it's a good thing Scotland Yard was on the case. Go ahead, Sheila.
Well, the assassination of Martin Luther King seems to have left a lasting impression on you that compelled you to write this book. And you were in Memphis when it occurred at a very young age. What was that experience like for you as a child?
I was in Memphis, and some of the conspiracy people have said maybe I was involved in the murder because, but I keep saying,
You were 6,
I was
right?
there.
You were 6.
I was there, though. I was there. I was 6. My father was an attorney and a law professor, and he worked for the law firm that represented the garbage workers when they went on strike, which is what brought King to Memphis on behalf of the garbage workers. And so he didn't work specifically on that case, but his colleagues were working on it, and I got an earful of it when I was little, not necessarily when I was 6, because I think when I was 6, I was probably just a little too young to understand all the nuances of injunctions and what the martial law that had been declared and what the looting was all about. But what I do remember was the fear, just the feeling that our city was ripping apart, that the country was ripping apart, that there was real fear in the voices of the adults that I was, hearing on the radio and on the television. And also the sense of history, like your hometown, Memphis, not a very big town, wasn't in the news very often. suddenly the glare of the world spotlight was on Memphis. And I remember that feeling very vividly, and that feeling of being embarrassed and humiliated and ashamed that this all had to happen in Memphis and that King was killed there, in the way that I think a lot of people from Dallas feel about the Kennedy assassination, the sense of, it's just a stigma that's on your hometown that you carry with you through your travels. Certainly I've met people along the way who, Memphis, isn't that where King got killed? It must be just a horribly racist, backward place. And, that sense of a stigma on a town, I think, is something that I lived with, my whole life, and maybe in some way motivated my interest in writing the book.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Caroline?
Can you talk a little more about some of the source?
Could you repeat it into the mic, please?
Oh, sorry. You mentioned that the number of aliases, however you pluralize that word, that James Earl Ray used. Can you talk a little more about your research process and some of the source material that you were able to gain access to, and how you found the information you needed?
Sure. Well, the ace in the hole for me in terms of the research for the book was a retired Memphis cop whose name is Vince Hughes, and he's devoted the past 35 years to collecting a digital archive of the King assassination. Basically, anything and everything he can collect, with an objective ultimately of putting it online for anyone to see. Pro-conspiracy people, anti-conspiracy people, and all stripes in between. He's a scholar and he's a gentleman, and he's doing this, for all the right reasons. He was a dispatcher on duty the night of April 4th, and this event touched him in some profound way, and he decided to start collecting all this stuff. He's also a bit of a computer geek, and was able to start, digitizing all this stuff starting in the 70s, and certainly by the 80s he was doing this actively. And so this is the first book to make use of this Hughes collection. And there are crime scene photos, and there are dispatcher recordings, and all the Scotland Yard documents, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police documents, and FBI stuff, and unredacted FBI stuff. That's the part that, I kept seeing these things. I had done some FOIA requests to get some stuff directly from the FBI, and almost invariably you get the redacted, blacked out, stuff. He's got all this stuff that's unredacted. I don't know how, and if he told me, he'd have to kill me, I'm sure, in terms of how he got this stuff. But that was really my ace in the hole. I mean, I did, as you asked, try to travel to as many of these places as possible. And I went to the usual archives too, like LBJ Presidential Library, and a lot of stuff in Memphis, and newspaper archives in London, and National Archives in Washington. But it all came back to Vince Hughes and his digital collection, which was just extraordinary. And everywhere I go, I sing his praises. Everyone needs to find a guy named Vince if you're going to be working on a project like this. Yeah.
Wow. So how long overall were you researching this project?
Well, I guess I was playing around with the idea of doing this for a couple of years before I began on it in earnest. It took me a little over 3 years to do. And it would have, I easily could have spent 25 years on it because of all the especially conspiracy theories, which take a long time just to figure out what's being argued, and because there's a lot of little rabbit holes along the way that you can go down and never come out.
Right.
So once I made the decision that Ray did it, and that the evidence was overwhelming that he did it, whether he did it with some help or not, I leave a lot of doors open there. Okay. It then simplified my research, because then it became like, all right, who was James Earl Ray? Let's really look at this guy's MO and all his aliases and his family. And so it simplified the narrative in some ways by making that decision.
And in telling the story, you employ creative nonfiction techniques, because it reads like a novel in a way. It reads so well.
Well, some stories lend themselves to that technique, and this one does, because it really was this epic, detective story, essentially. And one of the things that was in the Vince Hughes collection, was these FD 302 FBI reports, which basically are the interviews that led to, along the way to the capture of Ray. You find out, for example, that Ray left at the scene of the crime a pair of undershorts, and the undershorts had a little number stamped on the inseam of the undershorts. And that number was a new technology. It was a thing called thermoseal. So they found the company in Syracuse, and they said that came from a laundromat in Los Angeles. So then they go to Los Angeles, and you can find the FBI report where they interviewed the owner of the laundromat, and they say, no, this guy's name was Eric Galt, and so here's his address. So then they go, and so you can almost see every step of this detective story unfold, and I, really tried to make use of those FBI documents and do it kind of like it's been called a thriller, but I think of it as, just very much a kind of international detective story.
Do you see it lending its way to film or television? Have you been approached?
It has been optioned by Universal Pictures, and a really good historian who's become a screenwriter named Mark Bowden, the guy who wrote Black Hawk Down, is the screenwriter. And look, it's Hollywood. Who knows if it'll ever get made? But it is that kind of story. It has whatever you think about Ray and whatever you think about conspiracies, the question of how they caught this guy is just an epic and thrilling story, because he almost gets away repeatedly, and like I said at the very end, he almost made it onto that airplane. So it has all those sorts of twists and turns that I guess Hollywood directors like. But we'll see what happens.
Okay. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes, Jim. Can you stand up?
Yes.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit just about the mechanics of how you sold the idea to a publisher, and how the book came about? And also, during those 3 years you were working on it, was that your only job?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing this sort of narrative history now for about 12 years, and this is my third big kind of history project that I've done with Doubleday. So selling it to the publisher was really not a big deal, because I already had an editor and I already had an agent and a track record with Doubleday. But I still had to convince them that I was passionate about this story. They were very impressed by the Memphis connection. In fact, when I originally proposed this book, I really proposed it as a biography of my hometown. It was really going to be about Memphis and the blues and cotton and the Delta and Elvis and the important subjects, barbecue. Set against the backdrop of an assassination. That was, but as I got deeper into the story, the case kind of took over. It was like, you can't really, it's not that Memphis isn't important to the story. It is. It's a central character of the book, and the story keeps circling back to Memphis over and over again. But, the story evolved a lot from my proposal. And that's one thing when you have a great editor who can see that it's evolving and isn't holding you to your initial proposal. Because books have to breathe, they have to organically grow into what it is that they're trying to become. And so that's what happened in this case. It became really the story of this manhunt. Because at the time I proposed it, I didn't know about Vince Hughes and his collection, and I really didn't understand just how remarkable, just the shoe leather that was involved, and the amount of work and all the agents that were involved. If anything, my attitude towards the FBI was that they were a bunch of clowns and mostly racists who probably didn't want to find Ray. But as I got deeper into those papers, I realized they had expended a huge amount of work and effort and time and energy to find this guy. So
it sounds like you worked very collaboratively with your agent and the editor. So when you saw the story changing, you talked to them about the changing nature of the story.
Absolutely. I mean, I think very seldom does a proposal become a book and that the book resembles the proposal exactly. If it's, books have to evolve as you learn things and as you refine your ideas. And if the book doesn't evolve, there's usually a problem, I think, because it's like it's almost it's like a blueprint for. I think the same is true with all creative projects. And you think, paintings and theater and architecture. I mean, the project has to breathe, it has to change, it has to evolve.
Okay. Sheila, did you have another question?
Who are some of your favorite authors, and who inspired you in your work?
Well, the first writer that I ever met was a narrative historian, and I guess in retrospect he was someone who greatly influenced my work. He was a Memphis Civil War historian named Shelby Foote. It was this bearded sage that was on the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, and he smoked a pipe, and he drank a lot of bourbon, and he looked like a writer, and he talked like a writer, and he smelled like a writer, and his son and I were pretty good buddies growing up. So I suppose he was certainly one. When I went to college, there was a writer named John Hersey who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who became a novelist and taught a great course there and at Yale University. But he wrote the book Hiroshima. He was the first reporter to get to Hiroshima after the atomic bomb. So I suppose in terms of journalism, he was maybe, well, I'd say definitely my biggest influence.
Are there other questions from the audience? Yes, Frank, can you give Frank the mic, please?
You spoke at some lengths about the conspiracy theorists. Were there points of time during your investigation that you thought maybe Ray didn't do it? And when were you convinced?
Well, I would say for the first 6 months or so, I really kind of believed that, not so much that he didn't do it, but that he was part of a vast and shadowy conspiracy. Because growing up in Memphis, that's what I always heard. I mean, you hear something enough times, it begins to sink in, through osmosis or whatever. And I guess as a journalist, I thought that, Scott, I'm sorry, that that's a sexier story. I mean, if I can prove that there was this conspiracy and name names and show receipts and documents that prove that Hoover was in on it, or that the FBI brokered an assassination plot with the mafia or something. I mean, that's a sexier story, but I just couldn't find that. And I began to read the conspiracy books, some of which are interesting and actually, I think, very plausible, others of which are ludicrous and preposterous. I mean, they require you to believe two things, essentially. The first is that Ray is the stupidest and most gullible guy that ever walked the face of this earth. Because basically it requires that you believe that he followed orders from a stranger for a year and went all over the country doing things for somebody he didn't know. And buy a gun, yes, master. Buy a scope, yes. Go buy binoculars now. Go to this flop house and wait, yes, master. Ray was the cagiest, most cautious, most cynical jailbird you've ever met, and he. The idea that he would follow orders like this from a stranger is kind of ludicrous. The other thing that the conspiracy theorists really require is that you believe that hundreds, if not thousands, of people from multiple bureaucratic organizations got together and planned an elaborate thing that they then covered up for 30, 40 years. And, I don't want to sound unpatriotic, but I just can't really believe that my government is capable of that level of sophistication, not just, hatching the plot, but keeping it secret for 40 years. And, these different organizations like state and local, municipal, federal, they don't, my experience is governments don't really work very well with each other. Different, in this case, it involved all these different tiers and strata of government somehow working in perfect harmony. It stretches credulity to think they could do that.
But one of the reasons why people think that is because of Hoover's animosity toward Martin Luther King and the fact that he tracked him. He had people spying on him all the time. So that's partly why people think that.
Oh, I think it's absolutely reasonable and rational for people to look for a conspiracy because of the times, because of what Hoover's FBI was doing, because of a lot of other crazy things that were going on in the late 60s with our government and, the sort of the police state mentality that was prevalent during those years of the Vietnam War. So I get that, and I certainly write a lot in the early third of the book about Hoover and why he hated King so much, and what was that about, and why did he stick his field agents on King, and what exactly was the nature of what they were trying to do in terms of smearing him and actually urging him to commit suicide and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's one of the main reasons, though, you're right, why there's so many conspiracy theories, is Hoover's role in all this. Another reason is Ray himself. He's just such an odd guy. He did so many curious